ABC General Hospital spoilers reveal that there are moments when a conversation stops being just an exchange of words and quietly turns into something far heavier, something that lingers long after it ends. And that is exactly what unfolded when Maurice Benard sat down with Diedrich Bader on his podcast. On the surface, it could have been another familiar interview between two seasoned actors reflecting on their careers, sharing laughter, revisiting memories tied to projects like Napoleon Dynamite or the long-running sitcom The Drew Carey Show. But what emerged instead was something far more fragile, almost unsettling in its honesty, as if both men had quietly agreed to step beyond performance and reveal the parts of themselves they usually keep hidden from the world. The emotional weight of the conversation did not arrive all at once. It built slowly, almost imperceptibly, as Maurice guided the discussion from familiar territory into something more personal. For years, he has been known not only for his iconic presence on General Hospital, but also for his willingness to speak openly about mental health, something that has always set him apart in an industry that often rewards silence over vulnerability. Yet this time felt different. There was a quiet hesitation beneath his words, a subtle shift in tone that suggested he was not simply sharing for awareness, but because he was standing at a crossroads he could no longer ignore. Diedrich, known for bringing humor to audiences, revealed a truth that cut through the illusion many people hold about performers. The ability to make others laugh does not shield a person from darkness. In many ways, it becomes a mask that hides it more effectively. He spoke about avoiding heavy, emotionally draining roles, not out of fear of challenge, but because he understood the cost. Those roles do not stay on set. They follow you home, settle into your thoughts, and slowly reshape your emotional state. His choice to remain in comedy was not a limitation, but a form of self-preservation, a quiet rebellion against a system that often demands emotional sacrifice in exchange for artistic recognition. And yet, even with those boundaries, life found ways to break through. The past year, as he described it, was not simply difficult but devastating. Loss came not as a single blow, but as a relentless sequence, each one compounding the last, until grief no longer felt like an emotion, but like an environment he could not escape. The phrase he used carried a haunting simplicity, a chain of deaths, as if time itself had turned against him. It was in those moments that the illusion of control shattered completely, leaving behind a man who, despite his success, found himself overwhelmed by forces he could not manage. That sense of unraveling echoed in Maurice's own story, but with an even sharper edge. Because unlike Diedrich, Maurice did not just reflect on the past. He spoke about the present, and more importantly, the future, with a vulnerability that felt almost dangerous. There was a moment, subtle but unmistakable, when he allowed himself to say what many had perhaps feared, but never truly expected to hear, the possibility of stepping away. Not as a dramatic declaration, not as a calculated announcement, but as a quiet admission shaped by exhaustion and reality. His mental health, something he has fought to manage for years, is no longer a distant struggle. It is immediate, consuming, and increasingly difficult to contain. For someone so deeply tied to Sonny Corinthos, the idea of Maurice stepping back carries a weight that extends far beyond one actor's career. Sonny is not just a role, he is a pillar of the show's identity, a character whose presence has defined entire eras of storytelling. And yet, listening to Maurice speak, it becomes clear that even the strongest pillars can crack when the pressure becomes too great. There is no bravado in his words, no attempt to reassure or soften the truth. Instead, there is a quiet acknowledgement that the demands of the role, combined with the realities of his mental health, may no longer be sustainable. What makes this revelation even more unsettling is the way it intersects with the evolving narrative of General Hospital itself. Maurice did not speak in detail, but there were hints, fragments of thought that suggested the show is approaching another turning point. The return of familiar figures, names that carry their own history and emotional gravity, was mentioned not as a simple tease, but as part of a larger shift. Characters like Jason Morgan, Sam McCall, and Anna Devane are not just returning for nostalgia. Their presence signals a restructuring, a recalibration of the story's center of gravity, as if the show itself is preparing for a future where its most iconic figure may no longer stand at the forefront. This creates a tension that is both narrative and deeply personal. On one hand, the return of these characters promises renewal, a chance to re-anchor the story in relationships and conflicts that have long defined Port Charles. On the other hand, it raises an unspoken question. Is this resurgence of legacy characters a way of filling a void that has not yet been publicly acknowledged? If Maurice does step away, even temporarily, the impact will not be limited to Sonny's absence. It will ripple through every storyline, every relationship, every unresolved conflict that depends on his presence. At the heart of all this lies a conflict that cannot be resolved through plot twists or dramatic reveals. It is the conflict between identity and survival. Maurice has spent decades embodying Sonny, shaping him, evolving with him, and in many ways becoming inseparable from him in the eyes of the audience. But what happens when the role that defines you begins to threaten the very stability you have fought to maintain? What happens when continuing is no longer a sign of strength, but a risk you are no longer willing to take? There is no easy answer, and perhaps that is what makes this moment so powerful, because for once the drama is not confined to the screen. It exists in real life, in the quiet space where an actor must decide whether to keep going or to step back and protect himself. And in that decision, there is a kind of honesty that no scripted storyline can replicate. The conversation between Maurice and Diedrich ultimately becomes something much larger than a discussion about careers or even mental health. It becomes a reflection of what it means to endure, to reach a point where endurance itself is no longer enough. It challenges the audience to reconsider the way they view strength, to understand that sometimes the bravest choice is not to push forward, but to pause, to acknowledge the limits of what one person can carry. And as General Hospital moves forward with the promise of returning legends and shifting storylines, there is an underlying sense that the show is standing on the edge of transformation. Whether that transformation will be driven by necessity or by choice remains unclear. But one thing is certain, the emotional truth revealed in that conversation will linger, shaping not only how viewers see the characters on screen, but how they understand the people behind them, fragile, resilient, and human in ways that no performance can fully conceal. There is a quiet kind of devastation that does not arrive with explosions or betrayals shouted across rooms, but instead seeps slowly into the foundation of everything that once felt unshakable. And that is exactly the kind of crisis now unfolding around Maurice Benard and the uncertain future of Sonny Corinthos within General Hospital. The possibility that he may return only as a guest, a shadow of the force he once embodied, does not simply suggest a change in screen time, it signals something far more profound and unsettling: the gradual dismantling of a legacy that once defined an entire world. Because Sonny was never just a character moving through Port Charles, he was the gravity that held its most dangerous and fragile elements in balance, and once that gravity weakens, everything begins to drift into chaos. What makes this transformation so emotionally heavy is not just the absence itself, but what that absence allows to grow in its place. For years, Sonny's presence acted as an invisible barrier, containing threats before they could fully form, forcing enemies to hesitate, to calculate, to fear the consequences of stepping too far. Now, that restraint is gone. The enemies that once circled at a distance are no longer waiting. They are moving in, testing boundaries, probing weaknesses, and slowly expanding into spaces that used to belong to Sonny alone. This is not a sudden invasion, but something more dangerous, a quiet takeover, methodical and patient, driven by the understanding that power is easiest to claim when no one is left strong enough to defend it. And yet, the true danger is not simply external, it is internal, deeply rooted in the identity of the Corinthos family itself. Without Sonny's constant presence, the emotional structure that once held everything together begins to fracture. Decisions that once felt certain now carry hesitation. Alliances that once felt unbreakable begin to show cracks. The name Corinthos, once synonymous with protection and dominance, begins to shift into something far more fragile, almost like a memory of power rather than power itself. And that shift creates a vulnerability that enemies are quick to exploit, because they understand something the family is only beginning to realize. Without Sonny, the legacy becomes exposed. There is a haunting irony in this moment. Sonny built his empire not just through strength, but through control, through the ability to anticipate threats before they could take shape. His power was never passive. It required constant presence, constant awareness, constant sacrifice. Without that active force, the empire does not simply remain intact. It begins to decay, and that decay is not dramatic or immediate. It is subtle, almost invisible at first, but relentless in its progression. Every misdecision, every fractured alliance, every moment of hesitation becomes another crack in a structure that was never designed to exist without its creator. At the same time, the rise of new enemies brings with it a different kind of psychological warfare. These are not adversaries who simply want to replace Sonny, they want to erase him. They study his history, dismantle his influence, and reshape the narrative of Port Charles in a way that minimizes his impact. It is not enough for them to take control of his territory. They want to rewrite the story so that Sonny becomes a relic, a figure whose importance fades with time. And that intention is far more dangerous than any direct confrontation, because it attacks not just power, but memory, identity, and legacy itself. In this shifting landscape, the potential return of familiar figures like Jason Morgan, Sam McCall, and Anna Devane feels less like a celebration and more like a response to an unspoken crisis. Their presence suggests that the balance of Port Charles is being recalibrated, that the story is searching for new anchors to replace the one that is slowly slipping away. But even their return cannot fully replace what Sonny represented, because his role was never just about alliances or strategy. It was about the emotional center of the world, the constant force that connected power, family, loyalty, and fear into something cohesive. This creates a tension that runs through every layer of the narrative. On one level, there is the external conflict, the rise of enemies, the shifting power dynamics, the slow encroachment of chaos. On another level, there is the internal struggle, the quiet realization among those closest to Sonny that they may no longer be able to rely on him in the way they once did. And beneath all of that lies a deeper, more personal conflict, one that belongs not just to the characters, but to Maurice himself. Because stepping away, even partially, is not simply a career decision. It is a confrontation with identity, with the question of what remains when the role that defined you for decades begins to slip out of reach. There is something almost tragic in the idea that Sonny could return as a guest, appearing in fragments, present but no longer central. It transforms him into something ghost-like, a reminder of what once was, rather than a force shaping what is, and that transformation carries a weight that cannot be ignored. Because it suggests that the fall of Sonny Corinthos will not be marked by a single dramatic event, but by a gradual fading, a slow erosion that leaves behind only echoes of the power he once held. And perhaps that is what makes this moment feel so overwhelming. It is not just a turning point for a character or a storyline, it is a turning point for an entire world. Port Charles without Sonny at its center is not simply different, it is fundamentally altered. The rules have changed, the balance has shifted, and the future, once defined by his presence, now feels uncertain in a way it never has before. In the end, the crisis surrounding Sonny's legacy is not just about power being lost. It is about what happens when the foundation of a world begins to disappear while everything built upon it is still standing. It is about the slow realization that strength, no matter how enduring, is not permanent. And as the enemies close in, as the family struggles to hold itself together, and as the possibility of Sonny's diminished presence becomes more real, one question begins to rise above all others, quiet but impossible to ignore. Can anything he built survive without him? Or was his legacy always destined to collapse the moment he could no longer carry it?